Hello once again, and welcome to another edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. We're joined by 620 CKRM AgriNews Director Ryan Young and the Chief Agricultural Editor for SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hursh. I'm your host, Doug Falconer. I'm Agriculture Director at GX94 in Yorkton. A couple of big stories happened this week, gentlemen. I guess we'll start off first with the fact that Saskatchewan has a new agriculture minister. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe unveiled his cabinet on Thursday morning, and our new agriculture minister is Daryl Harrison. What's your reaction to that news, Kevin?
It's actually somebody I didn't know, somebody I hadn't speculated about. Appears to have a really good pedigree, especially on the cattle side of agriculture. May have some things that he needs to brush up on issues of most importance to the grain industry. Comes from that southeast Saskatchewan riding of Cannington. Uh, as board member of Sask Stock Growers, served on council. I suspect that David Merritt, who moves out of agriculture now into highways, will now have to attend a lot fewer meetings and events than he did before, and that now will fall upon Daryl Harrison. There's just a lot of demand across the province for the presence of the agriculture minister, and David Merritt and those before him were very gracious in giving of their time.
Ryan, you know a little bit about Daryl Harrison, apparently.
Yeah, I've met him a few times over at some ag news conferences and events. I've said it before here on the program, wherever David Merritt was, a few guys like Daryl was not too far behind him. Doug Steele would be another guy that used to be at those news conferences as well. But I've met Daryl a few times. He seems like a nice guy. And like Kevin said, he's got the background with cattle and he's got experience in government as well, working as a legislative secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture. So that's going to serve him well. And I managed to speak with him on Friday morning, just his overall thoughts on being the ag minister. He said obviously it's an honor to be selected as the next minister, and knows that he's got big shoes to fill with David Merritt going to the Ministry of Highways. Merritt has previously been the ag minister since 2018, so we'll see how everything goes. And obviously, on Friday, it's kind of technically day one for Daryl, just getting his feet wet on how everything is working from a ministerial perspective and setting up meetings with the various farm groups like the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, the Stock Growers Association. So, looking forward to that. And just one more point as well, the farm groups that I mentioned, they're welcoming of the announcement and they look forward to meeting with him.
Kevin, David Merritt had been agriculture minister since 2018. How would you assess his job in that role?
I think he's probably been one of the most popular and been perhaps uh, competent agriculture ministers. Not that his predecessors in recent times have had any major problems, but well liked, widely traveled, very gracious, prepared to listen. I seldom heard anyone that had anything negative to say about David Merritt. So there indeed will be big shoes to fill for Daryl Harrison.
Would that be your take as well, Ryan?
Yeah, I agree with what Kevin said. Merritt did a fine job as provincial agriculture minister, considering that there's been some recent challenges over the years, whether that was the drought of 2021 or the commodity prices, how volatile they've been. The drought last year helping out the cattle sector, especially with getting through that tough time and getting feed and helping with some of the costs as well and some of the work that he's done with his federal agriculture minister counterpart as well, and making sure that business management programs are in place and available for producers, and his work in trying to get said programs to be a little more reactive and flexible and quick in terms of any kind of disastrous events that happen or whatever. So overall, with his body of work, it's pretty good. It's up there.
I would echo your sentiments as well. I know you and I have many times, Ryan, contacted David Merritt for interviews. He was always very gracious, usually did them really quickly. When he couldn't, he usually apologized for, not getting you back to us sooner. But always made time for the media, which is what you want your agriculture minister to do, and he did a very good job of it. So, and of course, he's my home MLA from Wood River. That's where I grew up, so kind of knew he'd be a good guy at it anyway. So we'll move on now to the U.S. election that was held this week. And of course, Donald Trump has been reelected, returning to the White House after a 4-year absence. Will this affect agriculture at all, Ryan?
I believe so, just based on some of the conversations that I've had with the Canadian Cattle Association, talking with Tyler Fulton, who's the vice president. One of the big concerns is the incoming negotiation or the next review of the Canada-United States-Mexico trade agreement that's due for review in 2026, especially when it comes to the supply management sector. The Trump administration prior in 2016 to 2020 and those last round of negotiations, they kind of targeted that sector, especially dairy specifically. And there's concern there that he might target them again and maybe other sectors as well. And another primary concern is the widespread 10% tariff that Trump campaigned on during the presidential campaign trail. So whether that is going to come to fruition or not, that remains to be seen. But those are some of the primary concerns that I've heard around the ag community.
What have you heard, Kevin?
Everybody is in an analysis mode trying to figure out what stated Trump policies are going to mean for all sorts of sectors, including agriculture. In addition, just trade walls, tariff walls, there seems to be a real fear that he'll get into a tariff war with China in particular, and there may be fallout for that for Canada as well. And the other things out there is just such a wild card to know how it's all going to play out and all going to react. But I think that, as Ryan stated, the review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico free trade agreement will become a renegotiation and a very difficult one. And I wouldn't be surprised that after a lot of trying that the three sides will actually walk away from that agreement and will be without an official trade agreement. So everyone is trying to figure out where this was going, trying to separate the rhetoric from what the actions may be, and trying to figure out how the dominoes may all fall on the various stated policies of the incoming president.
Something else I thought I should bring up was the fact that the Democrats under Joe Biden had brought up voluntary country of origin labeling, and I believe it was supposed to take effect January 1st, 2026. Of course, this was in response to the mandatory country of origin labeling that Barack Obama brought in many, many years ago, which was eventually defeated by the WTO, and they had to do away with it. But what do you think will happen with voluntary country of origin labeling?
Good question. It's the kind of protectionist policy that would seem to fall right into Trump's America First mandate and mantra. But on the other hand, this was a Democrat Party proposed initiative or supported initiative. So hard to know whether that will continue in its same form or take the place of something else. But we have such a continental livestock market that flows freely with livestock and meat products across the border that any such impediment really complicates life for everybody, and it is a net loss to both countries. So unfortunate when you see trade barriers of this sort.
And of course, last time Donald Trump was president, his agriculture secretary was Sonny Perdue. Do you speculate that we could see a return of him, or do you think there might be somebody new?
Again, speculation is ongoing, and people are lining up and pointing, and it's going to be him. It might be her. It might be him. So really, no inside view of that at all. And I've heard some interviews with people that are reported to be potential contenders, but of course they can't say whether they're a contender or not until they're actually named. And if you look back, what was Sonny Perdue's legacy? They tend to take a back seat to what the president says and we don't hear a lot about what the Agriculture Secretary is doing necessarily in this country. It's some of the bigger policy plays that end up being important. The one other thing, though, very important in agriculture is what the Americans do with their biofuel policy, especially with renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. Right now, there's a lot of product that's supposedly used cooking oil that's coming in to be used in the renewable diesel market. Some people say that a lot of that is actually just palm oil with a French fry thrown into it to make it seem like it's used cooking oil. There's quite a backlash to this. I think the fear is that the Americans will decide that there will be no outside foreign oil come in, and then that could have an impact on Canadian canola oil. So one of the things to watch very closely is to see what their biofuel, renewable fuel policies are going forward. That will affect a lot of things in Canada, including the crushing industry and some new canola crush plants that are still on the drawing board.
Well, we've also heard that the labor strife continues at the ports in British Columbia and the Port of Montreal. In fact, I believe it's Port of Montreal has issued a deadline for 8 o'clock Eastern Time Sunday for the longshoremen out there to accept the offer, or else they'll be, I think, locking out everybody out at the Port of Montreal. Have you been following this, Ryan?
I've been keeping tabs on it, and just seems like it's one thing after another, and it keeps escalating, and it just shows no signs of slowing down whatsoever. Just kind of thinking about what happened with the major railways and kind of how that went down. And Federal Labor Minister Stephen McKinnon just initially trying to let the two sides get a deal done by themselves, but we know that wasn't really the case. He eventually ordered them to get back to work and to get a deal in place, and just letting the ports kind of let them deal with it themselves. It seems like a questionable move, in my opinion. Um, it just seems to be a complete mess over in the ports across the country here. And a common thing that gets brought up as well as a result of these things is Canada's reputation as a reliable supplier. Seeing all this happen, it makes countries wonder, like, should we do business with Canada? We should take our business elsewhere or go to a different port, because maybe while we have to pay more, at least we know it's going to get to the destination it needs to go. So there's a lot to consider here, and I hope it ends sooner rather than later.
Kevin, we've also heard that the BC ports, I believe they're scheduled to talk again on Saturday, November 9th. What's your take on all of this?
Well, in this case, it's containerized agricultural traffic that's affected, not bulk grain movement. So it's things like large green lentils, canary seed, mustard, specialty crops that can't move in bulk. So it's not had the same urgency as when the railways were down and all movement for everything was stopped. It's still very serious for that sector of agriculture. Unfortunately, it hasn't been receiving the national news attention that it warrants. And the Canadian Pulse and Special Crops Association has been doing some lobbying and trying to ramp up awareness. But it, especially with an American election this week, they haven't had a whole lot of traction in the media.
All right, well, Bill C-282, that was the private member's bill in Ottawa that would take supply management right off the table when it came to negotiating free trade agreements. We heard that the Senate has actually amended it so that it will be sent back to the House of Commons, and it hasn't killed the bill, but it may end up eventually killing it. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's exactly the case. The amendment would have said that pulling supply management out of trade negotiations didn't apply to existing agreements or renegotiated agreements or agreements that are currently in negotiation. So that's a major amendment. I suspect it'll be kicked around, kicked back to the House of Commons. And the way these things take so much time on these sorts of bills, I think there's a very strong possibility that this will die on the order paper before the next election is called. And that, quite frankly, is its best fate. As I mentioned before, having that kind of a clause there as the Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement is renegotiated would be like waving a red flag in front of a bull, and it would not be helpful at all.
And of course, a couple of other private members' bills passed. And Ryan, you were following those, the right to repair legislation and the interoperability legislation. That's pretty big news.
It is absolutely, and it's kind of a long time coming, considering that the interoperability bill and the right to repair bill, the designation for them is C-244 and C-294 respectively. That would essentially amend the Copyright Act. They were first introduced in the House of Commons in 2022, and from last report earlier this year, actually, it was an interview that Kevin did with regards to these two bills, and the interviewee, Kevin, he was saying that the bills have to be passed as soon as possible so that farmers can, have this freedom to essentially, mix and match different sorts of farming equipment. For example, if you have a John Deere and you want to put a honeybee combine header on, you can certainly do that without any fear or worry whatsoever, as well as accessing some programs and tinkering with that to farmers' desire.
Yeah, it was Carlo Dade of Canada West Foundation that I interviewed back at the Edmonton Crop Crossroads conference last year, and that was in January. And he was worried then that the bill was going very slowly through the Senate. Well, we've had to wait a long time, but that bill, the interoperability bill, as well as the right to repair legislation, has now passed through the Senate, and I believe has received royal assent, and a very good thing to celebrate. Oftentimes we're talking about these private member bills and shaking our head as to whether they're good or bad legislation. I think overwhelmingly among farmers, these will be seen as good pieces of legislation and an important amendment to copyright.
And one of the groups that is happy about this is the Grain Growers of Canada and its executive director, Kyle Larkin. He said that they supported the bill right from the onset and spoke a few times in committee meetings advocating for it. So it's a victory for farmers as well.
Well, on that note, that'll conclude this week's edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. On behalf of our Chief Agricultural Editor, Kevin Hursh, and 620 CKRM Regina AgriNews Director, Ryan Young, I'm GX94 Yorkton Agriculture Director, Doug Falconer, saying so long until next time.